America in the 19th century was obsessed with spectacles. There were what were called freak shows, sideshows, traveling exhibits that put people on display for the world to gawk at. And in many ways, the Redbones, I wonder, were they feeling caught up in this circus-like atmosphere? But what happens when people become puzzles to be solved rather than human beings with their own story? Charles James McDonald Furman was a man driven by obsession. Furman's informants described Jeremiah's father as a, quote, yellow man who spent much of his life in the St. Stephen's area, where he married a woman named Edie Lucas, a figure that Furman described as, quote, a mixed breed Indian. He wrote about the Redbones. And it says, some Redbones in Privateer Township have as much Indian blood as the Cherokee governor. And it was praised by institutions like the Smithsonian, in part because it fed the era's desire to categorize and to classify and control narratives about people. Furman wasn't just documenting history, he was pushing against a societal taboo. And at the time, discussing the mixed race heritage of the Southern community was, to say the least, controversial. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for being with me here on my channel, where we talk about American identity and family stories. And I've shared some videos about the research I've done on some really unknown lines of my family tree, which took me from my more immediate Louisiana Creole heritage, my mom's great-grandmother, and I kind of tried to pick apart some of that family tree. And it brought me all over. But one of the connections I found were to a group in Louisiana known as the Redbones. Now, I did a whole video on this. YouTube took this video down, I think twice, muted out part of it once. It was a hot mess. So I don't know what's going to happen this time. But if you watched my video about some of the censorship I've been facing here on YouTube for telling these stories, I'm going to keep doing it, even though they're holding a lot of the AdSense money, or all of it. But suffice that to say is that I've been researching the Redbone story here in America. And a lot of people, including myself, I thought it was just like a designation based on your skin color, especially people with African heritage, mixed heritage in Louisiana. But that was not totally the case. There was actually a group of people called the Redbones. And there was a man who spent his whole life chasing after them. Charles James McDonald Furman, he went by his middle name, McDonald, was a man driven by obsession. An obsession that set him apart from his peers and his families in South Carolina. He was born March 1st, 1863. And as he was growing up in South Carolina during the Reconstruction era, he had a relentless curiosity that earned him both admiration and a fair bit of skepticism. To his neighbors, he was seen as a little eccentric. So what consumed Furman more than anything else in his life was a mysterious community that lived just a few miles away from his Cornhill plantation that he grew up on. These people were known by last names that I find in my family tree. The Goins, the Smilings, the Gibbses, the Chavises. This was a small, quiet group living in Privateer Township. But this world fascinated Furman. Why? Because of the mystery around their origins. Who were these swarthy-skinned people? And why were they so different? And why were they called Redbones? In the 1880s and 1890s, McDonald Furman became fascinated by his Redbone neighbors, and he made several attempts to convince state officials to conduct a scientific study on their origins. Unfortunately, his efforts at this point were unsuccessful, but it didn't deter him. When you are obsessed, you are obsessed, right? In another article, he highlighted the bizarre reality that encyclopedias were filled with the information about distant races that most people would never meet. But, quote, right here in our state, we have a peculiar race that is largely unknown, yet worthy of ethnological study. And so he's saying people kind of romanticize things across the world, people from a long time ago that, they'll never meet. But he's like, there are people right here in town that you could be running into, and they're part of a group that we really don't know anything about. Now, despite being grouped with African Americans, Furman noted that the people of this community did exhibit physical traits that indicated a mixture of European and also Native American ancestry, he explained. They are thought to be descendants of Indians and African Americans, but no one knows for sure. For Furman, this lack of certainty was unacceptable, and he set out to change it. And he said he found this distinction important, describing them as, quote, more apart to themselves than they are Hebrews of our state. For Furman, they weren't just another marginalized group. They were an isolated and unique people. So his lifelong friendship, though, with the Redbone community and his interest in the remnants of the Catawba Indians who were living nearby, this became his thing. He became the de facto go-to man about this community during this era. So from 1878 to 1903, Furman devoted his life to unraveling the enigma of this community's ancestry. So while the rest of Sumter turned a blind eye or made superficial assumptions about this group, Furman immersed himself in the world of the Redbones. For decades, he dug into records, he interviewed locals, he even published his findings in newspapers, hoping to bring attention to what he saw as an untapped treasure trove of ethnological knowledge. He wrote to his readers about how little the average person understood about this community. He said, quote, "They are a mixed race and they have never been slaves." Now, the Redbones aren't just another community. At the time, then, they were a riddle, a puzzle. They didn't fit into the carefully constructed racial boundaries of 19th century America. Quote, "The Redbones combined themselves the blood of wasted tribes, the early colonists, and the forest rovers, the runaway slaves, and the stray seamen," one historian noted. To Furman, they represented something far more complex than race. They were something that defied an easy explanation. And so he was drawn to that. And something that he wrote I wanted to share. It's called General Buffington's Indian Blood. And it was an article that he wrote about the Redbones. And it says, "Some Redbones in Privateer Township have as much Indian blood as the Cherokee governor." To the editor of the News and Courier, in brief but interesting notice of General T.M. Buffington, governor of the Cherokee Nation, which appeared in your columns a few weeks since, his, quote, 1/8 Cherokee blood was alluded to. So he's writing kind of a response to an article that there was a Cherokee governor and they had kind of mentioned that he had about 1/8 blood quantum. "We presume from this statement that his remaining 7/8 blood is white," he writes, "which would really make him not an Indian. How strange to read of a chief of a great Indian nation having so little blood of that nation that he is really not of it." This is Furman's thoughts. "It shows how things have changed since the Akanastota, the great warrior whose name figured conspicuously in the Cherokee War waged with the South Carolina settlers during the colonial time. There are some Redbones in Privateer Township who have at least as much Indian blood as General Buffington. One of these Redbones, Elizabeth Smiling, an aged woman now past the scriptural limit of 70, so he's saying she's over 70 years old, not only has I believe it says, a face that is strikingly like that of an Indian, but her hair was formerly of such length that she could sit on it. Her brother, Tom Gibbs, was a preacher among these people. McDonald Furman, Privateer, Sumter County, May 6th, I think 1900, it says, 1900 or 1903. So he's making this comparison. He's saying, well, the head of the Cherokee Nation is mostly not Cherokee by blood. And he said, quote, "Their features and color as a race show unmistakable evidence of Indian blood and white blood, or both." This will go into a whole nother topic that I've talked about in other videos and talked with other people about. How do we deal with blood quantum? Is that a good thing to do? And so I'm not going to get into that in this video, but I'll leave a link to that video below if you want to check that out. In 1897, a man named Mr. Mooney wrote to Charles McDonald Furman that, quote, "He felt that the Croatans, Redbones, Melungeons, Moors, and Portuguese were all local names for mixed Indian races along the Atlantic seaboard, with westward drift into the mountains." And it stated, quote, "It would be worthwhile of local investigators to go into the subject systematically. I think possibly the Indian remnants may have married with the convict apprentice importation of early colony days, as well as with the free Negro element." That's a real crazy way to say, basically, we should look at this group systematically. Let's pull together all the data we have, all the historical records we have. And he thinks that all of these names were basically for a triracial group that included, possibly Portuguese, European settlers. He's saying a free Negro element. I think he might be saying freedmen. I'm not totally sure what he meant by that. and other Native American groups. So eventually people start to take notice of what he's doing. And the Smithsonian took notice of his work, understanding the significance of what he had been uncovering. These weren't just people. These were a key to understanding the tangled history of race in America. But with that fascination came something darker. Over the last 2 years, I've been telling the stories that often get ignored. But lately, I've been facing an uphill battle behind the scenes of each video. My videos are getting flagged by YouTube when all I'm doing is sharing real history. If these stories have ever resonated with you or given you a new perspective, grab some Be a Good Ancestor merch and help me keep this channel going. Check out nytonashville.com. And maybe not necessarily for Furman. I think for Furman, he was a part of this community. He considered this his community. But I think for other people, there was this element of turning people just into objects of study. People start to become interested in the Redbones. Who are these people? Let's dig into this romantic, mysterious story. But the fascination sometimes comes at a cost. Now, at the time, Furman wasn't just documenting history. He was pushing against a societal taboo. And at the time, discussing the mixed race heritage of the Southern community was, to say the least, controversial, maybe even damaging for these people. I don't know. I mean, we're talking about Reconstruction, Jim Crow era. But Furman was undeterred. Now, imagine you're living your life as a spectacle. I wonder if that's what it was like for some of these Redbones. To many in Furman's time, they weren't people. They were curiosities. They were seen as oddities, one historian wrote. Now, America in the 19th century was obsessed with spectacles. There were what were called freak shows, side shows, traveling exhibits that put people on display for the world to gawk at. And in many ways, the Redbones, I wonder, were they feeling caught up in this circus-like atmosphere? I, was kind of thinking through, he's doing this important work. I think a lot of people are really thankful for the work that he did. But what happens when people become puzzles to be solved rather than human beings with their own story? And as a Smithsonian contributor, Furman's research was definitely valuable. We still definitely are looking at things that he did, but it wasn't free from the biases of his time. His findings on the Redbones often came with a tinge of curiosity, as if he was peering into a world that wasn't quite meant to be understood by him, but rather dissected. For the Redbones, this meant that their existence was subject to public curiosity, much like a traveling oddity. But McDonald Furman did do a lot, because we have a lot of his letters preserved. There's a huge collection called the McDonald Furman letters that you can check out. And in 1894, he had written a lot of letters about the Oxidines and others of Sumter, which he states are called Redbones. It's really helpful for us when we're doing genealogy to see these surnames and the locations and kind of situate ancestors, situate figures in history. And it was through his extensive research that he uncovered stories that had long been forgotten, including that of one of my ancestors. I believe it's my 6th great-grandfather, Jeremiah Goins, who was born before 1780. Furman's informants described Jeremiah's father as a, quote, yellow man who spent much of his life in the St. Stephen's area, where he married a woman named Edie Lucas, a figure that Furman described as, quote, a mixed-breed Indian. As I'm picking apart Charles McDonald Furman and looking at some of the valuable work that he's done, because there's work that I have gotten immense value out of as a historian and as someone who is just looking to my family history. But I do think the research raises some uncomfortable questions. When does the pursuit of knowledge cross the line into exploitation? Furman referred to the Redbones a lot as a, quote, peculiar race, distinct from Indian, black, or white populations of the region. And he was adamant that their true racial identity was Redbone, which at the time, I mean, we might say, well, that's kind of a derogatory term, but it was kind of taking the place of other derogatory terms of the time, like, quote, old issues or late freedmen, which white neighbors would use, and those were considered much more derogatory. And so at the time, Furman maintained that Redbone was not a pejorative term. However, over time, it did take on a little bit of a negative connotation. And many descendants of these families would eventually relocate to North Carolina, where they became known as the Smiling Indians, a name derived from a very common surname, Smiling. And so I think, when we're looking back at these old records, it's interesting because on some level, I'm like, man, I'm so glad that he was ahead of his time. He was there documenting, boots on the ground, talking to people, recording things, writing into newspapers so we can have those articles saved. But the other side, as I wonder, where is the ethical line, or where is it where now these people have become a case study? They've become a curiosity. And I think this is something we run into when we are looking at actual primary sources. I've said this before, but oftentimes we want to say, this is the good guy in the story and this is the villain. And just like real life, it's often very complex and nuanced. Now, sometimes it is pretty black and white. Someone's just a straight up villain, and we can all agree on that. But I think when we're looking back, especially 150 years ago, and, things aren't being done the way that we say should be done. It's not ethical, in our 2024 standards. But we don't want to paint with a broad brush. I would love to know your thoughts on that. What do you think about Charles McDonald Furman's obsession with the Redbone community? Was it well-intentioned? Do you think that it's something we should be proud of? He had a genuine interest in preserving history, local history. He's saying, hey, don't be so focused around the world. Let's preserve the history that's down the street from us. But on the other hand, it was praised by institutions like the Smithsonian, in part because it fed the era's desire to categorize and to classify and control narratives about people. Let me know what you think about that. And if you'd like to see the other videos I've done on the Redbones, I will leave a link to that playlist below in the description. And if you would like to support the work I'm doing here, I would appreciate that so much. One of the ways you can do that is hopping over to nytnashville.com and grabbing some merch, or you can hop over to patreon.com/NYTN and hang out with me there. Otherwise, we'll talk soon.